The horse's hooves pounded against the snow-covered ground, steam billowing from its nostrils as it raced through the blizzard. Inside the abandoned cabin, 17-year-old Emma Sullivan shivered violently, her wheelchair pushed against the dying embers of the fireplace. The battery on her phone was dead. The generator had stopped working hours ago. And her own father had looked her in the eyes before closing the door, leaving her alone as the storm of the century descended upon them. But miles away, something extraordinary was happening. The family's horse, Chance, had broken free from its temporary shelter, somehow sensing the unimaginable betrayal. As Emma's consciousness began to fade, the sound of desperate whinnying pierced the howling wind. Chance had returned, and he wasn't alone. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Richard Sullivan hadn't always been a cold man. There was a time when his laugh came easily, and his eyes sparkled with genuine joy. There was a time when he would scoop his daughter into his arms and spin her around their sprawling backyard until they both collapsed with dizziness and delight. That was before the accident. Before the medical bills that threatened his empire. Before his wife left, unable to handle the pressure of their new reality. Before Emma became, in his twisted mind, a burden rather than a blessing. The Sullivan family estate sat on the outskirts of Pinecrest, a picturesque mountain town known for its breathtaking views and brutal winters. Richard had purchased the property as a vacation home 15 years ago, when Sullivan Industries was at its peak. Back then, money flowed as freely as the champagne at their lavish parties. The mountain retreat represented everything Richard valued: exclusivity, status, and the power to own something beautiful that others could only admire from a distance. The main house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all glass and steel and perfectly angled wood beams that somehow looked both imposing and perfectly at home among the towering pines. A half-mile down a private road sat the guest cabin, rustic and charming, with its stone fireplace and hand-hewn furniture. And beyond that, nestled in a clearing surrounded by aspen trees, were the stables. Emma had fallen in love with horses the moment her father brought her to the property for the first time. She was 7 then, all gangly limbs and untamed curls, with her mother's deep brown eyes and her father's determined chin. Richard had intended the horses as mere accessories, the way wealthy men often collected beautiful things to complete a certain image. But Emma saw them differently. To her, they were magnificent creatures, with souls as deep as the mountain lakes. "Daddy, look! He's looking right at me," she had squealed, pointing at a young chestnut stallion with a white blaze running down his face. Richard remembered how the horse had approached the fence cautiously, ears pricked forward with curiosity as Emma stood transfixed. "Can I touch him?" she'd asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard had lifted her up so she could reach across the fence. The horse had stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he sniffed her small hand. Then, to everyone's surprise, he had pressed his muzzle gently against her palm. "He likes me," Emma had declared with absolute certainty. The stablemaster had appeared beside them. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "That's remarkable. We call him Last Chance. He was rescued from pretty terrible conditions. Been here 3 weeks, and that's the first time he's approached anyone voluntarily." "Last Chance," Emma had repeated, testing the name. "I'm going to call you Chance. We're going to be best friends." Richard remembered thinking how strange it was, this immediate connection between his daughter and the damaged horse. He had paid a small fortune for purebred Andalusians and thoroughbreds, yet Emma had chosen the rescue, the one animal in his collection that hadn't been strategically selected to impress his associates. As the years passed, Emma's bond with Chance grew stronger. She took riding lessons, showed a natural aptitude that made her instructors predict she might compete someday. Richard found himself genuinely proud watching his daughter transform from a timid girl to a confident young equestrian. For a while, the mountain property became a place of joy, rather than just another asset in his portfolio. Everything changed on Emma's 14th birthday. They had been celebrating at the estate, and Emma had been eager to show her friends her jumping skills. Richard had been distracted, taking a business call he'd deemed too important to postpone. He hadn't seen what happened, only heard the screams. By the time he reached the paddock, Emma was lying motionless on the ground, her body at an unnatural angle beside the jump she'd attempted. It wasn't Chance's fault. Everyone, including Emma, was adamant about that. Something had spooked him, a snake perhaps, or a sudden noise from the catering staff setting up for the party. The investigation was inconclusive, but Richard needed someone or something to blame. His daughter would never walk again, and the costs, financial, emotional, logistical, mounted with each passing day. Caroline Sullivan had tried to hold their family together. For almost a year, she'd coordinated Emma's rehabilitation, oversaw the modifications to their homes, researched experimental treatments, and attempted to pull her husband back from the edge of his growing resentment. But Richard had retreated into his work, staying at the office until midnight, taking international trips that stretched from days into weeks. She needs her father, Caroline had pleaded during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. What she needs is the best medical care money can buy, Richard had countered coldly. And someone has to earn that money. When Caroline finally left, taking a sizable divorce settlement but leaving Emma in Richard's primary custody at their daughter's insistence, something within Richard hardened completely. He hired the best caregivers money could buy and convinced himself that his financial provision was equivalent to love. Emma, now wheelchair-bound but as determined as ever, tried repeatedly to break through the walls her father had erected, but Richard kept her at arm's length, viewing her disability as both a liability to his company's image and a constant reminder of his failure to protect her. The only connection to their former life that remained intact was Chance. Richard had initially planned to sell all the horses after the accident, but Emma's desperate pleas had worn him down. "Please, Dad, don't take him away too," she had begged, and something in her voice so much like her mother's had made it impossible for him to refuse this one request. So Chance remained, along with a minimal staff to care for him. Emma visited less frequently now that getting around was more complicated, but Richard's assistant would arrange for her transport to the mountain property several times a year. Richard himself rarely accompanied her, always finding some critical business matter that required his attention in the city. This winter trip had been different. Richard's company was facing a crisis, a potential hostile takeover that threatened everything he'd built. He needed to review certain documents stored in the safe at the mountain house, sensitive information he didn't trust to digital formats. With his assistant out on medical leave and the weather forecast predicting only light snow, he had reluctantly agreed to bring Emma along when she expressed interest in checking on Chance. "It will just be for the weekend," she had said. "I miss him, and we hardly spend any time together anymore, Dad." Richard had acquiesced, though he'd made it clear that his work would take priority. They had arrived on Friday afternoon under clear skies, with Emma immediately asking to be taken to the stables while Richard secluded himself in his office. Martin Hayes, the property caretaker who had been with the Sullivans for over a decade, and helped Emma from the car to her wheelchair and then down to the stables. At 6 to 5, Martin moved slower than he once had, but he handled Emma with a gentle competence born from years of practice. "He's been waiting for you," Martin had said as they approached Chance's stall. Horses have memories longer than most people give them credit for. As if to prove Martin's point, Chance had immediately approached the stall door when he saw Emma, nickering softly and stretching his neck to reach her outstretched hand. "Hey, boy," Emma had whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I've missed you too." That night, the first flurries had begun, light and non-threatening. By Saturday morning, however, the weather report had changed dramatically. What had been forecasted as a minor system had merged with another front, creating conditions for what meteorologists were calling potentially historic blizzard conditions. Richard had been on the phone constantly, his voice echoing through the house as he attempted to manage his business crisis from afar. Emma had spent most of the day in the sitting room, reading and occasionally glancing out the window as the snow accumulated with alarming speed. By evening, the power had flickered several times before stabilizing thanks to the backup generator. Martin had appeared at Richard's office door, his withered face grave. "Mr. Sullivan, I've just received an alert. They're evacuating the valley. This storm is intensifying much faster than predicted. The main road will be impassable within hours. Richard had barely looked up from his laptop. We have everything we need here. The generator can keep us going for days. Martin had shaken his head. Sir, they're saying this could be the worst storm in 50 years. The emergency services are recommending immediate evacuation. They can't guarantee rescue operations if things get as bad as they're predicting. That had gotten Richard's attention. He had stared out the window at the thickening curtain of white, mentally calculating risks and opportunities as he always did. How long do we have? The patrol is making its way up the mountain now, helping people evacuate. They should reach our turnoff within the hour, but after that, Martin had let the implications hang in the air. Richard had nodded curtly. Fine. Pack what we need. I'll get Emma ready. It was when he'd entered the sitting room to inform his daughter of their imminent departure that the first real complication had arisen. What about Chance? Emma had asked immediately, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. Richard had dismissed her concern with a wave. The horses will be fine in the stables. They have shelter, food, and water. But if the storm is as bad as they're saying... Emma, we don't have time for this. Martin is packing the car. The road is already dangerous. Then let me go check on him quickly. Please, Dad. I need to make sure he's secure. Richard had checked his watch impatiently. The evacuation team will be here soon. We need to be ready. It will only take a few minutes. Martin can help me down there and back. Perhaps if Richard hadn't been so preoccupied with the crisis threatening his company. Perhaps if the growing howl of the wind hadn't set his nerves on edge. Perhaps if years of resentment hadn't already corrupted his judgment where his daughter was concerned, he might have handled the situation differently. Instead, he had snapped. For God's sake, Emma! It's a horse. An animal. We're talking about our safety now. Emma's face had hardened in a way that reminded Richard painfully of her mother. Chance isn't just an animal. He's family. More family than you've been lately. The barb had struck deeper than she probably knew. Richard had stormed out, finding Martin in the hallway organizing their emergency supplies. Sir, I've packed food, water, first aid supplies, and extra blankets, Martin had reported. I've also gathered Miss Emma's medications. Good, Richard had replied curtly. There's been a change of plan. I need you to go check on the horses, make sure they're secure for the duration of the storm. Martin had looked surprised. But, sir, the evacuation team will be here shortly. Yes. Emma and I will be ready. This won't take long, but she's insistent that someone check on her horse. The older man had hesitated, clearly torn between following his employer's instructions and what he suspected was the wiser course of action. Very well, sir. I'll be as quick as I can. As Martin had trudged through the rapidly accumulating snow toward the stables, Richard had returned to his office, hurriedly gathering the confidential documents he'd come to retrieve. His phone had buzzed with a text from his legal team. Carlisle making his move. Board meeting emergency session Monday morning. Need counter strategy immediately. The timing couldn't have been worse. If Richard couldn't get back to the city in time to prepare for that meeting, everything he'd worked for might collapse. The thought of losing his company, the one thing in his life he still controlled, completely had sent a wave of panic through him. He needed to get off this mountain, needed to get back to his team, needed to formulate a plan to save his life's work. The sound of vehicles approaching had pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Through the window, he'd spotted two snow-equipped SUVs with emergency lights, making their way up the private drive. Richard had hurried to the sitting room. The evacuation team is here. We need to go now. Emma had looked up from her phone. Martin isn't back yet. He went to check on Chance. He'll catch up, Richard had said dismissively, already moving to gather Emma's coat and gloves. A firm knock at the door had announced the arrival of the rescue personnel. Richard had opened it to find two men in heavy weather gear, snow clinging to their shoulders and boots. Mr. Sullivan? I'm Officer Ramirez with the Pinecrest Emergency Response Team. We need to get you and your family down the mountain immediately. The situation is deteriorating faster than expected. Richard had nodded briskly. Yes, we're ready. It's just my daughter and myself. Our caretaker went to secure the stables. He should be back any moment. Officer Ramirez had glanced at his partner with concern. Sir, we can wait a few minutes but not long. The west access road is already closed, and they're predicting this one won't last much longer. Richard had ushered them inside. My daughter is in a wheelchair. We'll need assistance getting her to the vehicle. The officers had entered the sitting room, where Emma sat by the window, still watching for Martin's return. Officer Ramirez had approached her with a gentle smile. Miss Sullivan, we need to get you to safety. Is there anything specific you need to bring with you? Emma had looked past him to her father. We can't leave without Martin. And I'm worried about Chance. Your caretaker will join us shortly, Officer Ramirez had assured her. As for the horses, animals are remarkably resilient in these conditions. They have shelter and instincts that serve them well. While his partner had begun helping Emma into her coat, Officer Ramirez had pulled Richard aside. Sir, I should warn you that the evacuation center is not ideally equipped for individuals with special needs. They're doing their best, but resources are stretched thin with so many people being displaced. Richard had frowned. What are you saying? Just that. It might be challenging. Space is limited, facilities basic. We're prioritizing getting everyone to safety first, then addressing specific needs as resources allow. Richard had glanced at his daughter, now being bundled up by the other officer, then back at Ramirez. A cold calculation had begun forming in his mind. Is there an alternative? Somewhere with better accommodations for her situation? Ramirez had hesitated. The regional hospital in Westridge is accepting some evacuees with medical needs, but they're 30 miles in the opposite direction, and those roads are becoming treacherous as well. Richard had checked his watch again, thinking of the board meeting, of Carlisle's takeover attempt, of everything at stake. How long would we be expected to remain at the evacuation center? Hard to say for certain. The forecast suggests at least 72 hours before it would be safe to return to isolated properties like yours. Possibly longer. 3 days. 3 days in an overcrowded shelter with limited facilities, while his company slipped through his fingers. At that moment, the back door had banged open, and Martin had appeared, covered in snow and breathing heavily. The horses are secure, Mr. Sullivan. I've given them extra feed and checked that everything is battened down. Good. Richard had replied absently, his mind still churning through options. Officer Ramirez had clapped his hands. All right then. We should move out immediately. My partner will help with Miss Sullivan's wheelchair. Sir, if you and your caretaker can grab whatever essential supplies you've packed, we'll get everyone loaded up. And... It was during the chaotic process of moving toward the vehicles that Richard had made his decision a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the officers helped Emma navigate her wheelchair through the rapidly accumulating snow toward the waiting SUVs, Richard had pulled Martin aside. Listen carefully, he had said in a low voice. I need to get back to the city immediately for an emergency board meeting. Emma will slow us down, and the evacuation center isn't equipped for her needs. Martin's eyes had widened. Sir, what are you suggesting? The guest cabin has its own generator. It's well stocked with supplies. I need you to stay behind with Emma until I can arrange proper transportation for her. Something better equipped for her wheelchair, perhaps medical transport to that hospital the officer mentioned. Stay behind? But sir, they're evacuating everyone because it's not safe. The cabin is solid. You've weathered storms here before. Nothing like what they're predicting, sir. And Miss Emma needs, I know what my daughter needs. Richard had cut him off sharply. And right now, she needs proper accommodation, not some crowded gymnasium floor. I'm trying to protect her. Even as the words had left his mouth, Richard had known they were a lie. He wasn't protecting Emma. He was protecting himself, his company, his legacy. But the lie had come easily after years of similar self-deception. Martin's face had shown open disbelief. Mr. Sullivan, I don't pay you to think, Richard had snapped, then immediately regretted his harshness. More calmly, he'd added, this is a temporary solution. I'll send appropriate transportation as soon as the worst of the storm passes. Before Martin could object further, Officer Ramirez had approached them. Gentlemen, we need to move now. The radio report just informed me they're closing this road in 20 minutes regardless of who's been evacuated. Richard had made a split-second decision that would change everything. Officer, there's been a change of plan. My daughter and our caretaker will be staying in our guest cabin. It's fully equipped with its own generator and supplies. I need to return to the city for an urgent matter." The officer's expression had darkened. "Sir, that's against our recommendations. This evacuation order is mandatory for good reason. I understand your concern, but my daughter's medical needs make the evacuation center problematic, as you yourself pointed out. The guest cabin is designed for extended stays in all weather conditions. Martin here has weathered many storms on this property and knows how to manage the generators and supplies." Martin had opened his mouth to protest, but Richard had silenced him with a sharp glance. Officer Ramirez had looked deeply troubled. "Sir, I strongly advise against this. We cannot guarantee emergency services will be able to reach this location if conditions worsen. I understand the risks and take full responsibility," Richard had replied with the confident authority that had served him so well in boardrooms. "Now, if you could help us transfer my daughter to the guest cabin before you depart, I would appreciate it." The officer had hesitated, clearly conflicted between his duty to evacuate everyone and his lack of authority to force compliance from a property owner. "I'll need you to sign a waiver." "Of course." What had followed was a flurry of activity that Richard would later recall only in disjointed fragments. The officers reluctantly helping to transport Emma to the guest cabin. Emma's confused and increasingly alarmed yes. Questions. Martin's attempt to explain the situation while shooting accusatory glances at Richard. The hastily signed waiver acknowledging that they were choosing to remain against official recommendations. Richard gathering his essential documents and personal items. And finally, the moment that would replay in Richard's nightmares. Standing in the doorway of the guest cabin, looking at his daughter's face as comprehension dawned. "You're leaving?" Emma had asked, her voice small, yet somehow filling the entire room. "I have to get back for an emergency board meeting. Carlisle is making his move. If I'm not there, I could lose everything." "Everything?" She had repeated the word slowly, as though testing its weight. "What exactly is everything to you, Dad?" Richard had avoided her gaze, focusing instead on adjusting his coat. "You'll be fine here with Martin. The cabin is well stocked, and the generator has enough fuel for days. I'll send appropriate transportation for you as soon as it's safe." "Don't do this," Emma had whispered. "Please, Dad." "Don't leave me here." For a brief moment, Richard had hesitated. Something in her voice had pierced the armor he built around his heart. A note of the little girl who had once looked at him as though he hung the moon and stars. But then his phone had buzzed again. Another urgent message from his legal team, and the moment had passed. "This is just for a few days. Martin will take good care of you." Emma's expression had hardened into something Richard had never seen before, no anger or hurt, but a profound disappointment that cut deeper than either emotion could have. "You know what? Go. Just go. You've been leaving me in different ways since the accident anyway. At least this time you're being honest about it." Richard had wanted to defend himself, to explain that everything he did, his work, his sacrifice, his absence, was ultimately for her benefit. But the words had sounded hollow even in his own mind. Instead, he had nodded curtly to Martin. "You have my number. Call if there's any emergency." And then he had walked out, closing the door on his daughter's silent stare, hurrying through the thickening snow to where Officer Ramirez waited in the idling SUV. "Last chance to reconsider, Mr. Sullivan," the officer had said as Richard climbed into the passenger seat. Richard had fastened his seatbelt, resolutely not looking back at the cabin. "Let's go." As they had begun the treacherous descent down the mountain, Richard had told himself he was making a necessary sacrifice, that sometimes hard decisions were required to protect what mattered most. He had repeated this mantra silently as they passed the turnoff to the stables, where Chance and the other horses waited out the storm, unaware of the human drama unfolding around them. What Richard couldn't have known then was that his decision had set in motion a chain of events that would strip away every pretense he had built his life upon, forcing him to confront the truth about what and who truly mattered. The evacuation had been more difficult than anticipated. Twice during their descent, Officer Ramirez had been forced to stop and clear fallen branches from their path. The snowfall had intensified to the point where visibility extended barely beyond the hood of the vehicle, and the howling wind rocked the SUV with each powerful gust. "You sure your staff member can handle this?" Ramirez had asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly as they navigated a particularly treacherous curve. "No offense, but he seemed pretty shaken by your decision." "Martin has been with us for years," Richard had replied. "He knows the property inside and out." What Richard hadn't mentioned was the doubt gnawing at him with increasing intensity. Martin was reliable, yes, but he was also aging, and the look of betrayal in the older man's eyes had spoken volumes about his feelings regarding Richard's decision. "What about your daughter? She seemed pretty upset." Richard had stared out the window at the swirling white abyss. "Emma is stronger than she appears. She's had to be." The officer had given him a sidelong glance, but said nothing more. By the time they reached the main evacuation point, a community center at the base of the mountain, the storm had escalated to near whiteout conditions. Officer Ramirez had helped Richard inside, where dozens of other evacuees huddled on cots and folding chairs, many looking shell-shocked by the sudden disruption to their lives. "The last transport to the city leaves in 20 minutes, Ramirez had informed him. "After that, everyone stays put until the storm passes." Richard had nodded gratefully. "Thank you for your assistance." As the officer had turned to leave, he'd paused. "Mr. Sullivan, I hope you know what you're doing, leaving them up there." The words had hung between them, heavy with judgment. Richard had stiffened. "As I said, I take full responsibility for my decision." "Sometimes responsibility comes after the fact," Ramirez had replied quietly, before disappearing into the crowd. Richard had stood alone then, his expensive wool coat and leather briefcase marking him as different from the other evacuees in their practical winter gear. Few had glanced his way with curiosity or recognition. The wealthy businessman who owned the modern mansion on the mountainside, now reduced to waiting for transportation like everyone else. His phone had buzzed yet again. A text from his CFO. "Carlisle called emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. Monday instead of afternoon. Need to prep defense strategy tonight." Richard had checked his watch. If the transport to the city left on time, and if the highways remained passable, he might just make it back in time to salvage his company's future. The knowledge had hardened his resolve. He had made the right decision. Emma would understand eventually. She had to. As he'd taken a seat on a bench near the exit, waiting for the final transport announcement, Richard's gaze had fallen on a family huddled together nearby. A mother and father sat on either side of a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9, who was clearly frightened by the storm's fury. The parents had their arms wrapped protectively around their son, murmuring reassurances as the building shuddered under another violent gust of wind. Something about the scene had pierced through Richard's carefully maintained detachment. When had he last held Emma that way? When had he last put his own body between her and the world's threats? Physical or otherwise. Not since the accident, certainly. Perhaps not even before that, if he was truly honest with himself. A memory had surfaced then, unbidden and unwelcome. Emma, at 10 years old, celebrating after winning her first ribbon at a local riding competition. Her smile radiant as she'd run to him, ribbon clutched in her small hand. "Did you see me, Daddy? Did you see what Chance and I did?" And Richard, phone pressed to his ear, important call in progress, had managed only a distracted nod and a quick pat on her shoulder before turning away to continue his conversation. The recollection had sent a wave of shame through him, quickly suppressed as the loudspeaker had crackled to life. "Attention evacuees. The final transport to the city will be departing in 10 minutes. This is your last opportunity to leave the evacuation center until the storm subsides. Please gather your belongings and proceed to the main entrance if you are continuing to the city." Richard had risen, clutching his briefcase. This was the right decision, the necessary decision. Emma was safe with Martin. The guest cabin was sturdy. The generator was reliable. Everything would be fine. As he joined the small group boarding the transport van, Richard had deliberately pushed aside the nagging voice of doubt. He couldn't afford distraction now. Not with so much at stake. The company needed him. His employees depended on him. His legacy hung in the balance. And yet, As the van had pulled away from the evacuation center, Richard had found himself looking back at the mountain, now barely visible through the storm. For the briefest moment, he had considered asking the driver to stop, to let him return to the community center, where he could wait out the storm and then go back for Emma when the roads cleared. But the moment had passed, and Richard had turned resolutely forward, focusing on the crisis that awaited him in the city. Emma would be fine. She had to be. Meanwhile, back at the Sullivan estate, the true nature of the situation was becoming alarmingly clear to Martin and Emma. "He really left," Emma had said flatly, watching from the cabin window as the emergency vehicle's taillights disappeared into the swirling snow. It wasn't a question but a statement of painful fact. Martin had stood awkwardly in the center of the cabin's main room, still processing what had just occurred. "Miss Emma, I don't know what to say." Emma had wheeled herself away from the window, her expression unreadable. "There's nothing to say. This is who he is now, probably who he's always been." The older man had moved toward the fireplace, busying himself with building a fire to supplement the heat from the generator. "Your father believes he's doing what's best. He mentioned arranging proper transportation for you once the storm passes." Emma had laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Let's not pretend, Martin. He left because I'm an inconvenience. Because dealing with my wheelchair at an evacuation center would slow him down when he has important business to attend to." Martin had winced at the bitterness in her voice, but couldn't find the words to contradict her. Instead, he had focused on practical matters. "Let me check the generator and take inventory of our supplies. The rangers said this storm could last several days." As Martin had moved around the cabin, checking systems and counting provisions, Emma had remained unnaturally quiet, staring into the growing flames of the fireplace. The silence had stretched between them, interrupted only by the howling wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin's timber frame. Finally, Martin had returned to the main room. "The generator is running well, and we have enough fuel for 4 to 5 days if we're careful. There's plenty of food and water, and I've located the emergency medical kit. Your medications are all here." He had hesitated before adding, "We'll be all right, Miss Emma." Emma had looked up at him then, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You don't have to stay, you know. You could have gone with him." Martin's weathered face had softened with compassion. "And leave you alone? Never. I wouldn't blame you. This isn't what you signed up for. Looking after this property and everyone on it is exactly what I signed up for." Martin had moved to sit in the armchair across from her. "That includes you and those horses. Speaking of which, I should probably check on them again once this first wave of the storm passes." Emma's expression had immediately shifted from resignation to concern. "How were they when you saw them? How was Chance?" "They seemed calm enough. Extra feed and fresh water. The stable is solid, and I made sure all the doors were secure." Emma had nodded, momentarily reassured, but then frowned as a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin windows. "I've never heard it like this before. Worst storm in decades, according to the rangers," Martin had agreed. "But this cabin has stood since your grandfather's time. It'll stand through this." They had settled into a routine then, with Martin tending the fire and preparing a simple dinner while Emma had busied herself arranging the living space to be more accessible from her wheelchair. Neither had spoken much, both lost in their own thoughts, as the storm's fury had intensified around them. It was during dinner that the first real problem had arisen. A sudden mechanical groan had echoed from outside, followed by the lights flickering ominously before stabilizing. Martin had immediately risen. "That didn't sound right. I better check the generator." Pulling on his heavy coat and gloves, he had ventured outside, the door bursting open with the force of the wind as soon as he'd unlatched it. Emma had watched anxiously as he disappeared into the swirling whiteness, the door slamming shut behind him. Minutes had ticked by with excruciating slowness. 5, then 10, then 15. Emma had positioned her wheelchair near the window, straining to see any sign of Martin through the near whiteout conditions. When the door had finally burst open again, she had exhaled in relief. Martin had stumbled inside, covered in snow, his face alarmingly pale. "The main fuel line to the generator is freezing up," he had reported between labored breaths. "I cleared it for now, but with these temperatures dropping, it's going to keep happening." Can we fix it? I can try to insulate it better, but I'll need some supplies from the main house. The emergency kit should have what I need. You can't go out in this again, Emma had protested. It's getting worse by the minute. Martin had smiled grimly. Don't have much choice, Miss Emma. Without that generator, we lose heat, light, everything. At least wait until there's a break in the storm. From the sound of it, we might be waiting a long time. Martin had moved to the fireplace, warming his hands briefly. Don't worry. I know this property like the back of my hand, even in a whiteout. Emma had watched helplessly as Martin had prepared to venture out again, this time with a length of rope tied around his waist and secured to the cabin's door handle a lifeline in case visibility dropped to 0. I'll be back within the hour, he had promised. Keep the fire going and stay warm. The door had closed behind him, and Emma had been left alone with only the crackling fire and howling wind for company. She had tried to distract herself by checking her phone, but the signal had long since disappeared. The isolation had pressed in around her, tangible as the cold that seeped through the cabin's windows despite the fire's warmth. An hour passed, then another. The generator had sputtered twice more, but continued running. There had been no sign of Martin. Emma had tried to remain calm, telling herself that Martin was simply being thorough, perhaps checking on the horses while he was out. But as a third hour had crept by, genuine fear had begun to take hold. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The lights had flickered again, more persistently this time. Emma had maneuvered her wheelchair closer to the fireplace, fighting the growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. She strained to hear any sound that might indicate Martin's return, but there was only the relentless howling of the wind and the occasional groan of timber as the cabin withstood another powerful gust. "Come on, Martin," she whispered, eyes fixed on the door. "Please be okay." As if in answer to her plea, the generator outside gave a final, sputtering cough before dying completely. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the orange glow of the fireplace. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She was alone, in a wheelchair, in a remote cabin, during what might be the storm of the century. And the only person who knew she was here had been gone for hours. The cold began creeping in almost immediately. Without the generator, the electric heating system was useless. The fireplace would provide some warmth, but only for the main room, and only as long as the wood supply lasted. Emma glanced at the dwindling pile beside the hearth and made a quick calculation. If she was careful, she might have enough for another day. After that, Emma shook her head, forcing back the wave of panic threatening to overwhelm her. "Think," she commanded herself aloud, her voice sounding small in the vast silence. "What would Mom do? What would Dad do before the accident? Before everything changed?" Moving with practiced efficiency, despite the darkness, Emma gathered what supplies she could reach from her wheelchair: extra blankets from the sofa, a flashlight from the side table drawer, the satellite phone her father kept for emergencies, which she found in its usual place on L. The bookshelf. She tried the phone immediately, but as expected, received an error message. The storm was blocking the signal. The fire cast eerie shadows across the cabin walls as Emma considered her options. She could stay put and hope Martin returned soon. She could try to venture outside herself, a nearly impossible task given her wheelchair and the conditions. Or she could prepare for the possibility of being alone for an extended period in increasingly dangerous circumstances. Emma opted for the third approach. She had survived the accident that took her mobility. She had survived her mother's departure and her father's emotional abandonment. She would survive this too. First, she needed to conserve heat. Emma wheeled into the cabin's small bedroom and stripped the bed of its blankets and comforter. Back in the main room, she arranged them near the fireplace, creating a nest of sorts where she could stay warm during the night. Next, she inventoried the food and water Martin had identified earlier, calculating how to ration it if necessary. The physical activity helped keep the fear at bay, but as the hours crept by with no sign of Martin, Emma found herself repeatedly drawn to the window, searching the darkness for any hint of movement. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, the wind now screaming rather than howling as it tore around the cabin's corners. It was during one such vigil at the window that Emma noticed something strange. A movement in the distance, barely perceptible through the swirling snow. She pressed closer to the glass, flashlight raised, trying to get a better look. For a moment, she thought she must be imagining things trick of the light, or a snow-laden branch bending in the wind. But then it came again. Definite movement, following a pattern too deliberate to be random. Something or someone was out there. "Martin?" Emma called, though she knew her voice couldn't possibly carry beyond the cabin walls. Her heart raced as she strained to see through the darkness. The movement was coming closer, slowly but steadily. A surge of hope flooded through her. Martin had made it back. He must have gotten lost in the whiteout conditions, but somehow found his way. Emma wheeled herself to the door, ready to help him inside. But as the shape emerged from the swirling snow into the faint light cast by the fire through the window, Emma froze. It wasn't Martin. It was Chance. The horse stood just beyond the cabin's small porch, his chestnut coat crusted with snow, his breath forming great plumes of steam in the freezing air. He pawed at the ground nervously, clearly distressed, but made no move to leave. "Chance?" Emma whispered in disbelief. "How did you?" The horse nickered softly in response, a sound Emma would have recognized anywhere. It was the special greeting he had always reserved just for her. For a moment, Emma simply stared, unable to process what she was seeing. Chance should be safe in his stall in the stable, half a mile away. The doors had been secured. Martin had confirmed that himself. For the horse to be here now, something must have happened. Something serious. A new fear gripped Emma's heart. Had the stable been damaged? Were the other horses in danger? And Martin, had he gone to check on them when the generator started failing? Was he injured somewhere between the cabin and the stable? Chance nickered again, more urgently this time, and pawed at the ground. In all the years Emma had known him, she had never seen the horse this agitated. He seemed to be trying to tell her something. "I can't come out there, boy," Emma said, her voice breaking. "I can't get through this snow in my chair." Chance snorted, steam billowing from his nostrils, and moved closer to the porch steps. He stopped there, looking directly at Emma through the window, and let out another urgent whinny. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. Chance had come to find her. Somehow, he had sensed something was wrong, and broken out of the stable to reach her. But she couldn't go with him, couldn't follow whatever message he seemed desperate to convey. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't." For several long minutes, horse and human regarded each other through the window glass, one trapped by circumstance, the other by nature. Then, with a final snort that almost sounded like frustration, Chance turned and disappeared back into the swirling whiteness. Emma remained at the window long after the horse had vanished, her mind racing. Chance's appearance had confirmed her worst fear. Something was definitely wrong. Martin should have returned hours ago. The stable must be compromised in some way for Chance to have escaped, and now her only potential link to help had disappeared back into the storm. The fire crackled behind her, a log collapsing into embers, with a shower of sparks. Emma turned from the window, suddenly aware of how cold she had become standing there. She needed to conserve her energy and stay warm. She needed to think clearly. Moving back to her nest of blankets near the fireplace, Emma tried to formulate a plan. The satellite phone still showed no signal. The generator was dead. The firewood was limited. And now she knew for certain that something had gone wrong beyond the safety of the cabin walls. As Emma added another precious log to the fire, a new terrible thought struck her. If Chance had broken free from the stable and found his way to the cabin through near-zero visibility, what might have driven him to do so? Horses were prey animals, naturally inclined to seek shelter during storms, not leave it. Unless he was looking for someone. Unless he sensed danger. "Martin," Emma breathed. The name a prayer and a fear combined. Had the caretaker made it to the stable, found something wrong, and sent Chance somehow? It seemed unlikely. Horses weren't messenger pigeons. But Emma had always believed there was something special about her connection with Chance. something that defied conventional explanation. Outside, the wind's pitch changed, dropping from a scream to a low, ominous moan. The storm was shifting, perhaps entering a new phase. Emma glanced at her watch. It was just past midnight. Martin had been gone for over 6 hours. Exhaustion tugged at her, but Emma fought it off. Sleep felt dangerous somehow, as though surrendering to it might mean surrendering entirely. Instead, she kept vigil, alternating between watching the door, tending the fire, and checking the satellite phone for any hint of a signal. It was during one such check, around 2 in the morning, that Emma heard it. A sound different from the wind's constant barrage, deliberate rhythmic noise coming from outside. She wheeled quickly to the window, flashlight raised. Chance had returned, but this time, he wasn't alone. Squinting through the glass, Emma could make out a dark shape draped across the horse's back. A form that looked horribly like a body. "No!" she gasped, a cold dread seizing her that had nothing to do with the plummeting temperature. "No, no, no." With trembling hands, Emma unlocked the door, a task made difficult by the ice that had formed on the metal. She pushed against it with all her strength, but the snow that had accumulated on the porch created a barrier her arms alone couldn't overcome. "Chance!" she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Here, boy, come closer." As if understanding her plea, the horse carefully navigated the few steps to the porch and approached the partially open door. Emma could now see clearly, or rather who was, draped across his back. Martin lay there, unconscious or worse, his body secured by what looked like pieces of rope from the stable. His face was deathly pale where it wasn't covered in frost, and his right leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "Martin," Emma called, reaching through the gap in the door. "Martin, can you hear me?" There was no response from the elderly caretaker, but Emma could see the faint cloud of breath escaping his lips. He was alive, at least for now. Emma's mind raced. She needed to get Martin inside, get him warm, treat whatever injuries he had sustained. But how? She couldn't lift him from her wheelchair, and Chance couldn't enter the narrow cabin door with Martin on his back. For a moment, Emma felt utterly helpless, a feeling she had sworn never to surrender to after the accident. Then, looking at Chance's intelligent eyes, an idea formed. "Chance, down," she commanded, using the voice she had developed during their training sessions years ago. "Down, boy." To her amazement and relief, Chance seemed to understand. With careful movements that spoke of an intelligence far beyond what most would attribute to a horse, he lowered himself to his knees on the porch, bringing Martin's body within Emma's reach. Now came the hard part. Emma would have one chance to do this right. She positioned her wheelchair as close to the door as possible, locked the brakes, and then, using all the upper body strength she had developed since losing the use of her legs, she pulled herself to the floor. From there, she dragged herself the short distance to the door on her elbows. The cold bit into her immediately, the porch boards icy beneath her body, but Emma forced herself to focus solely on the task at hand. Reaching through the partially open door, she managed to grasp Martin's coat. With agonizing slowness, she began to pull, using leverage and momentum rather than pure strength. "Good boy, Chance," she murmured encouragingly, as the horse remained perfectly still, allowing Martin's weight to shift gradually from his back to the porch floor. It was painstaking work. Every inch gained came at the cost of tremendous effort, and Emma's arms burned with exertion. But gradually, inch by excruciating inch, she managed to pull Martin's upper body through the door gap and into the cabin. Once his torso was inside, the rest followed more easily. Emma continued pulling until Martin lay fully inside the cabin, then used the last of her strength to push the door closed against the accumulated snow and howling wind. The silence that followed seemed deafening after the storm's constant roar. Emma lay beside Martin on the cabin floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling from cold and exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. Martin's life depended on what she did next. First, she needed to get back into her wheelchair, a task she had performed countless times, but never under such dire circumstances. Using the door handle for leverage, Emma pulled herself upright, then maneuvered back into her chair with practiced movements. Next, she assessed Martin's condition. The caretaker was alive, but deeply unconscious, his breathing shallow and his pulse weak when she pressed her fingers to his neck. His clothes were soaked through, and his right leg was definitely broken, the bone possibly visible beneath his torn pants leg, though Emma avoided looking too closely. Most concerning was his temperature. Even through her gloves, Emma could feel how dangerously cold Martin's skin had become. Hypothermia was the immediate threat. Moving with urgent efficiency, Emma gathered the blankets from her makeshift nest and covered Martin where he lay. Ideally, she would have removed his wet clothes first, but that was beyond her physical capabilities. Instead, she wheeled to the fireplace and added more logs, building the flames higher to increase the heat in the room. From the emergency medical kit Martin had shown her earlier, Emma retrieved chemical heat packs, breaking the internal seal to activate them before tucking them around Martin's core under his armpits, at his groin, around his neck. Basic first aid training she'd received years ago reminded her that these were the areas to target when treating hypothermia. Next came the broken leg. Emma couldn't do much beyond basic stabilization, but she used 2 cooking utensils as makeshift splints, securing them with duct tape from the emergency kit to prevent further movement of the fracture. Throughout it all, Martin remained unconscious, though occasionally a moan escaped his lips when Emma's ministrations caused him pain. She took these sounds as positive signs. Response to stimuli meant his condition wasn't as dire as it could have been. When she had done everything possible for Martin given her limitations, Emma moved back to the window. Chance still stood on the porch, seemingly content to wait now that his burden had been delivered. Looking at the horse's frost-coated mane and exhausted stance, Emma felt a wave of emotion crash over her. "You saved him," she whispered, pressing her hand to the cold glass. "You found him and brought him home." As if in response, Chance nickered softly and dipped his noble head. Emma glanced back at Martin's still form. He was stable for now, but his condition would deteriorate without proper medical care. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, they were miles from the nearest hospital. The satellite phone remained useless. They were, effectively, on their own, unless... Emma's gaze returned to Chance, standing steadfast in the howling blizzard. An impossible idea began to form in her mind. A desperate, possibly foolish idea, but perhaps their only chance. The horse had already proven himself capable of navigating the storm. He had found Martin somewhere between the cabin and the stable, understood he needed help, and somehow transported him back to the cabin. Could he do more? Could he perhaps carry a message? It seemed absurd on the surface horses weren't trained for such tasks. But Emma knew Chance wasn't just any horse. Their bond had always been special, their communication transcending normal human-animal relationships. If any horse could understand what she needed, it would be Chance. Decision made, Emma moved quickly. From the emergency kit, she retrieved a waterproof pen and a small notebook. On a page, she wrote in large, clear letters, "Emergency at Sullivan Cabin. 2 people stranded. 1 injured critically. Need immediate medical evacuation. Emma Sullivan." She tore out the page and searched for something waterproof to put it in. Finding nothing suitable, she improvised, wrapping the note in a plastic bag from the kitchen and securing it with tape. Then, gathering her courage, she once again opened the door just enough to reach Chance. "Good boy," she murmured, stroking his frost-covered neck. "One more job, okay? The most important one." Carefully, she secured the makeshift message pouch to Chance's halter, using the last of the duct tape to ensure it would stay in place even through the storm's fury. "Go!" she urged, looking directly into the horse's intelligent eyes. "Go find help, Chance. Evacuation center. Valley. People. Find them." Chance snorted, steam billowing around his muzzle, and pawed at the ground. "Go," Emma repeated, giving him a gentle push. "Run." For a moment, the horse hesitated, as if reluctant to leave her behind. Then, with a final soft nicker that almost sounded like a promise, Chance turned and disappeared into the swirling whiteness. Emma watched until the last glimpse of his chestnut coat vanished into the night, then closed the door against the storm once more. She had done everything possible. Now, All she could do was wait, tend to Martin, and hope that a miracle might find them before it was too late. The hours that followed passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. Emma divided her attention between maintaining the fire, monitoring Martin's condition, and checking the satellite phone for any hint of a signal. The caretaker remained unconscious, though his breathing had become stronger as his body slowly warmed. The broken leg was a serious concern, but hypothermia had been the immediate threat, and that, at least, seemed to be receding. As dawn approached, though, the only indication was the subtle lightening of the darkness outside. From black to deep gray, Emma found herself drifting in and out of consciousness. Her body, pushed to its limits, demanded rest. She fought it as long as she could, but eventually surrendered, slumping in her wheelchair beside Martin's makeshift bed on the floor. Her dreams were fragmented and disjointed. She was riding chance through summer meadows, the wind in her hair and the sun warm on her face. She was arguing with her father in his sleek city office, his expression cold and distant. She was a child again, sitting on her mother's lap as they read stories by a fireplace, much like the one before her now. The sound that woke her was so distant and muffled that at first Emma thought it was part of her dreams. A mechanical throbbing, rhythmic and persistent, growing gradually louder. She blinked, disoriented, then glanced at her watch. Just past 7 in the morning. She'd been asleep for nearly 3 hours. The sound continued, becoming more distinct with each passing moment. Emma wheeled quickly to the window, her heart pounding with fragile hope. Through the still falling snow, she could make out a pulsing light in the sky. A light that could only be man-made. A helicopter, she breathed, hardly daring to believe it. They found us. Martin stirred on the floor, mumbling something incoherent as the sound intensified. Emma moved to his side immediately. Martin, wake up. Help is coming. Can you hear me? Help is coming. The caretaker's eyelids fluttered, then opened. His gaze was unfocused at first, then gradually cleared as he registered Emma's presence. Ms. Emma? He croaked, his voice barely audible. What happened? You had an accident, she explained quickly. Chance found you and brought you back. Now there's a helicopter. They're coming for us. Martin frowned, clearly struggling to process her words. Chance? The horse? Yes, he saved you. And I think he might have brought help too. Emma squeezed his hand gently. Just hold on a little longer. The helicopter's rotors were clearly audible now, the powerful downdraft causing the cabin to vibrate slightly as the aircraft maneuvered into position somewhere nearby. Emma wondered briefly how they would land in such conditions, but the question became irrelevant as a new sound reached her ears, voices calling out, approaching the cabin. Here! Emma shouted as loudly as she could. We're in here! Moments later, the door burst open, admitting a swirl of snow and 3 figures in heavy rescue gear. Emma Sullivan? The lead figure called, voice muffled by a protective mask. Yes, Emma confirmed, tears of relief springing to her eyes. And this is Martin Hayes. He's injured, hypothermia, broken leg, possibly other injuries. The rescue team moved with practiced efficiency, 2 of them immediately attending to Martin, while the third approached Emma. Are you injured? The rescuer asked, removing her mask to reveal a woman's face, lined with concern. No, I'm fine, Emma assured her. Just exhausted. Please, take care of Martin first. The woman nodded. I'm Sergeant Dawson with Mountain Rescue. We need to get you both to the medical center immediately. The storm's giving us a small window, but it's closing fast. How did you find us? Emma asked, as the team prepared Martin for transport, carefully transferring him to a specialized stretcher. Sergeant Dawson smiled. Strangest thing. A horse showed up at the evacuation center around dawn, nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Had a note attached to its halter. Some kind of miracle that animal made it through this storm. Chance, Emma whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Is he okay? The horse? Yeah, he's being looked after. Wouldn't let anyone near him at first, but once we read your note, he seemed to calm down, like he knew his job was done. Dawson shook her head in wonder. Never seen anything like it in 20 years of rescue work. Within minutes, the team had Martin secured and ready to move. They turned their attention to Emma, explaining how they would transfer her from the wheelchair to the helicopter. "We can't bring the chair," Dawson explained apologetically. "Weight restrictions in these conditions." "I understand," Emma assured her. "Just get us out of here." As they carried her from the cabin, Emma caught a final glimpse of the space that had been both prison and sanctuary for the past terrible hours. The fire was dying, the food untouched, the satellite phone still showing no signal on the table. They had survived by the narrowest of margins, thanks not to technology or preparedness, but to the extraordinary actions of a horse who refused to give up on those he loved. Outside, the snow continued to fall, though less violently than before. The helicopter waited in a small clearing, rotors turning steadily, creating a circle of visibility in the otherwise white landscape. As they approached the aircraft, Emma scanned the surrounding area, half hoping to catch a glimpse of Chance, though she knew he was safely at the evacuation center. "Your father's been notified," Sergeant Dawson shouted over the helicopter's noise as they prepared to load Emma inside. "He's meeting you at the medical center." Emma nodded, a complex mix of emotions washing over her at the mention of her father. There would be time to process those feelings later. For now, she focused solely on the miracle of their rescue, on Martin's survival, on Chance's incredible journey. As the helicopter lifted off, rising above the storm-battered landscape, Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the cabin grow smaller before disappearing entirely into the swirling whiteness. She said a silent prayer of gratitude for the loyal animal who had saved them both, promising that somehow, someday, she would find a way to honor what he had done. What Emma couldn't know as they flew toward safety was that her father was already facing his own reckoning, one that would forever change the man he had become and set in motion a journey of redemption that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Richard Sullivan had arrived at the city late Sunday night, his mind entirely focused on the looming board meeting and Carlisle's takeover attempt. He had checked into his penthouse apartment, immediately connecting with his legal team for a strategy session that lasted well into the early morning hours. They had formulated a plan to counter Carlisle's move, identifying key board members to approach and preparing arguments that would protect Richard's control of the company. When his alarm had sounded at 6 a.m., Richard had risen after barely 2 hours of sleep, feeling oddly hollow, despite the confidence his team had expressed in their strategy. As he'd stood under the shower's steaming spray, images of Emma's face had intruded into his thoughts, her expression as he'd closed the cabin door, the profound disappointment in her eyes. He had pushed the images aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. The takeover attempt was an existential threat to everything he'd built. Emma was safe with Martin. The guest cabin was well constructed. The generator was reliable. Everything would be fine once this crisis passed. Richard had dressed in his most authoritative suit, the armor he wore to intimidate opponents in the corporate battlefield. As he'd adjusted his tie before the mirror, his phone had rung an unrecognized number with the Pinecrest area code. For a fraction of a second, Richard had considered ignoring it. The board meeting was just 2 hours away. He needed to focus. But something, perhaps the lingering guilt he refused to acknowledge, had made him answer. "Richard Sullivan." "Mr. Sullivan, this is Officer Ramirez, with the Pinecrest Emergency Response Team." Richard had felt his stomach drop at the man's grave tone. "What's happened?" "Sir, we've received an emergency communication from your property. A horse arrived at the evacuation center early this morning with a distress message from your daughter." "A horse? A horse?" Richard had repeated stupidly, unable to process what he was hearing. "Yes, sir. According to what we've pieced together, your caretaker went missing during the night, and your daughter was alone in the cabin with no heat or communication. Somehow, the horse carried a message from her. We've dispatched a rescue helicopter, which should be reaching them any minute now." Richard had gripped the edge of his dresser, suddenly lightheaded. "Are they's Emma?" "We don't have details on their condition yet, sir, but the rescue team is equipped for medical emergencies. They'll be transported to Westridge Regional Medical Center. That's about 2 hours from your current location, I believe." "I'll be there. I'll be there." Richard had said immediately, all thoughts of the board meeting evaporating. "Please, tell them I'm coming." Richard had ended the call and stood frozen for several seconds, the full weight of what he'd done crashing down upon him. He had abandoned his daughter, his child, in a desperate situation, prioritizing his company over her safety. And now, a horse and animal had shown more loyalty, more courage, more love than he had. Moving as if in a trance, Richard had called his executive assistant, instructing her to dispatch the company helicopter immediately. Then, he'd called his CFO. "I won't be at the board meeting," he'd said without preamble. "What?" "Richard, this is everything we've been preparing for. Carlisle is... My daughter was just rescued from the mountain cabin where I left her during the blizzard. She's being airlifted to Westridge Medical Center. I'm going there. Now." A stunned silence had followed his words. Then, slowly, his CFO had responded. "Go to your daughter, Richard. We'll handle Carlisle." "This company was everything to me," Richard had said, a strange calmness settling over him. "I thought losing it would be the worst thing that could happen. I was wrong." "What are you saying?" "Lie. I'm saying save what you can. Make whatever deals you need to make. My family comes first from now on." Richard had hung up, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. As the elevator had descended from his penthouse to the lobby, he'd felt as though he was watching himself from a distance, a stranger making choices the Richard Sullivan of yesterday would have found incomprehensible. The ride to the helipad had passed in a blur. Richard had sat silently in the back of his luxury car, staring at the storm-lashed city through the tinted windows. News reports on the radio had described the blizzard as historic and life-threatening, with multiple casualties already confirmed throughout the region. Each word had been a knife twisting in Richard's gut. By the time his company helicopter had lifted off, flying directly into the storm system that was finally beginning to weaken, Richard had reached a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. It was as though the layers of self-deception and rationalization he had wrapped around himself since Emma's accident had been stripped away, leaving only the harsh truth exposed. He had failed as a father. Failed in the most fundamental duty of parenthood to protect his child. And he had almost lost her because of it. The flight to Westridge had been turbulent, the pilot navigating carefully through the storm's lingering effects. Richard had barely noticed, his mind filled with a torrent of regrets and memories. Emma, as a toddler, taking her first wobbly steps, while he clapped encouragingly. Emma on her first day of school, brave smile masking her nervousness. Emma in her hospital bed after the accident, her face pale but determined as she told him, "It's okay, Dad. I'm still me." And he had withdrawn from her, treated her disability as an inconvenience, a blemish on his perfect life. Left her with caregivers while he buried himself in work, and finally abandoned her in a snowstorm because a board meeting seemed more important than her safety. The helicopter had landed at Westridge Regional Medical Center just after 9 in the morning. Richard had rushed inside, his usual commanding presence reduced to that of a desperate father seeking news of his child. "Emma Sullivan," he demanded at the reception desk. "She was airlifted here from Pinecrest. Where is she?" The receptionist had checked her computer. "Ms. Sullivan is in the emergency assessment unit, sir. If you'll take a seat, I'll let them know you're here. I need to see her now." "Sir, the doctors are with her. Please, have a seat. Someone will come speak with you shortly." Richard had wanted to argue, to pull rank, to demand immediate access, as he would in any business situation. But something had stopped him. A voice in his head that sounded remarkably like his daughter's. "That's not how this works, Dad. You don't get to control everything." So he had taken a seat in the waiting area, hands clasped tightly in his lap, and done something he hadn't done in years. He had waited, patient and powerless, like any other worried parent. 20 minutes later, a doctor had approached him. "Mr. Sullivan? I'm Dr. Patel. I've been overseeing your daughter's care." Richard had stood immediately. "How is she? Is she hurt?" "Emma is remarkably well, considering the circumstances," Dr. Patel had assured him. "She's suffering from exhaustion and mild hypothermia, but there's no lasting damage. She's a very resourceful young woman." Relief had flooded through Richard, making his knees weak. And Martin Hayes, my caretaker? Dr. Patel's expression had grown more serious. Mr. Hayes is in more critical condition, severe hypothermia, a compound fracture of the right tibia, and frostbite to his extremities. He's being prepared for surgery now to address the leg fracture. His age is a complicating factor, but he's stable. Can I see Emma? Yes, but briefly. She needs rest more than anything else right now. Dr. Patel had led Richard through the emergency department to a curtained-off area where Emma lay on a hospital bed, connected to monitoring equipment and covered with warming blankets. Her eyes had been closed, her face pale but peaceful. Richard had approached slowly, suddenly uncertain. What could he possibly say to make this right? How could he ever explain or justify what he had done? As if sensing his presence, Emma's eyes had opened. For a long moment, father and daughter had simply looked at each other, a chasm of hurt and betrayal stretching between them. Emma, Richard had begun, his voice breaking. How's Martin? She had interrupted, her tone neutral. In surgery. They say he's stable. Emma had nodded slightly. And Chance? The horse? They didn't tell me, Richard had admitted. But I'll find out. I promise. A heavy silence had fallen between them, filled with all the words Richard couldn't find and Emma wouldn't say. Finally, Richard had pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, leaning forward with his head bowed. There's nothing I can say that would excuse what I did, he had said quietly. Nothing that would make it right or take away the hurt I've caused. I abandoned you when you needed me most. Put my work ahead of your safety, your life. I've been doing that for years, telling myself it was for your benefit, that providing financially was the same as being there for you. It's not. It never was. Emma had watched him silently, her expression unreadable. I don't expect your forgiveness, Richard had continued. I haven't earned it. But I want you to know that I understand now what I've done, to you and to us. And if you'll let me, I want to try to rebuild whatever can be salvaged between us. Not as your financial provider, but as your father. Emma's eyes had filled with tears then, but her voice when she'd spoken had been steady. The board meeting, Carlisle's takeover. What about your company? I'm not going to the meeting. But your company isn't worth losing you, Richard had finished firmly. Nothing is. A tear had slipped down Emma's cheek. I want to believe you mean that. But you've chosen the company over me so many times, Dad. Since the accident, it's like you couldn't bear to look at me anymore. The truth in her words had cut through Richard's defenses like a blade. You're right. After your accident, I couldn't face what had happened. I couldn't face my failure to protect you. So I ran. I buried myself in work because there, at least, I still had control. I still knew how to succeed. He had taken a shaky breath. But it was never about you being a burden, Emma. It was about me being a coward. Emma had closed her eyes briefly, absorbing his words. When she had opened them again, there was a fragile hope visible beneath the hurt. Chance saved us, you know. He found Martin in the storm somehow, brought him back to the cabin. Then he carried my message to the evacuation center. The rescuers said it was a miracle he made it through the blizzard. A horse showed more courage and loyalty than I did, Richard had acknowledged, shame evident in his voice. He never gave up on you. No, Emma had agreed softly. He didn't. Richard had reached for her hand then, hesitantly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She hadn't. Her fingers had curled around his, neither fully accepting nor rejecting the connection he offered. I'm so sorry, Emma, he had whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make this right, if you'll let me. Emma had studied his face for a long moment. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet, she had said finally. But I think maybe I'm ready to start trying. It was more than Richard deserved, and he had known it. He had nodded, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it. That's all I can ask for. Get some rest now. I'll be here when you wake up. I promise. As Emma had drifted off to sleep, exhaustion finally claiming her, Richard had remained by her bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, and contemplating the profound shift that had occurred within him. The company that had consumed his life for so long now, seemed trivial compared to the second chance he had been given with his daughter. Later that day, after Emma had rested and Richard had checked on Martin's condition following his surgery, father and daughter had their first real conversation in years. Sitting in Emma's hospital room, they had begun the delicate process of rebuilding what had been broken between them. "I want to know what happened on the mountain," Richard had said. "All of it." Emma had recounted the harrowing experience: Martin's disappearance, the generator failing, the cold darkness of the cabin, and Chance's miraculous appearance. As she described how the horse had brought Martin back to the cabin, and how she had struggled to pull the unconscious caretaker inside, Richard's admiration for his daughter's strength and resourcefulness had grown exponentially. "How did you know Chance would find help?" he had asked when she explained attaching the note to the horse's halter. Emma had shrugged slightly. "I didn't know for sure. I just believed in him, I guess. Chance and I have always had a connection that's hard to explain. It's like he understands things on a level most animals don't." Richard had nodded, remembering how the young horse had approached Emma all those years ago, recognizing something special in the little girl with the bright eyes and determined spirit. The rescuer said he collapsed when he reached the evacuation center. Emma had continued, worry creasing her brow. "Have you heard anything about his condition?" Richard had shaken his head. "Not yet, but I'll find out immediately." He had pulled out his phone, ready to make whatever calls were necessary. It had taken several hours and multiple conversations with increasingly higher-ranking officials, but by evening, Richard had secured information about Chance. The horse had indeed been severely exhausted upon reaching the evacuation center, but was recovering under veterinary care at a nearby facility. The news had brought visible relief to Emma's face. "I need to see him as soon as I'm discharged," she had insisted. "He saved our lives, Dad. Mine and Martin's both. We'll go together," Richard had promised. First thing. True to his word, when Emma was discharged from the hospital the following day, Richard had arranged for a specially equipped vehicle to transport them to the veterinary facility where Chance was being treated. Martin remained hospitalized, his recovery expected to take significantly longer. But his prognosis was good. The reunion between Emma and Chance had brought tears to the eyes of everyone present, including Richard himself. The moment Emma's wheelchair had entered the large stall where Chance was recuperating, the horse had nickered softly and moved immediately to her side, lowering his head to rest his muzzle gently against her shoulder. "Hey, boy," Emma had whispered, stroking his neck with trembling hands. "You did it. You saved us." Chance had snuffled her hair in response, his intelligent eyes seeming to convey understanding beyond words. Veterinarian had explained that while Chance had been suffering from severe exhaustion and exposure, there would be no lasting damage. "It's remarkable, really," she had added, watching the horse nuzzle Emma affectionately. "Most animals would have sought shelter during a storm of that magnitude, not ventured out into it. And to navigate to the evacuation center, carrying a message? It defies conventional explanation." "Not if you know Chance," Emma had replied softly. Standing slightly apart, Richard had observed the deep bond between his daughter and the horse, a connection he had never truly appreciated before. In that moment, he had made a decision that would mark the beginning of his redemption. In the weeks that followed, as the region recovered from the historic blizzard, Richard Sullivan underwent a transformation more profound than anyone who knew him could have imagined. True to his word, he had not attended the emergency board meeting. His absence had indeed resulted in changes at Sullivan Industries, a partial acquisition by Carlyle's firm, with Richard retaining a significant but no longer controlling interest. But rather than fighting the takeover, Richard had negotiated terms that allowed him to step back from day-to-day operations while preserving jobs and the company's core mission. The business world had been shocked by the sudden pivot from a man known for his relentless ambition and control. Richard, however, had been focused elsewhere. He had temporarily relocated to a hotel near Westridge, spending his days with Emma as she recovered her strength, and visiting Martin regularly as the caretaker slowly healed from his injuries. The elderly man had been understandably wary of Richard at first, but as he witnessed the genuine change in his employer's behavior and priorities, a cautious respect had begun to develop between them. Most significantly, Richard had purchased the veterinary facility where Chance was recovering, transforming it into a state-of-the-art equine rehabilitation center. What had begun as a gesture to ensure Chance received the best possible care had evolved into something much more meaningful as Richard learned about the many rescue horses in need of similar services. The Sullivan Equine Rehabilitation Center. Emma had read from the architectural plans Richard had presented to her 1 month after their ordeal. "You're really doing this?" "With your help," Richard had confirmed. "I want you to be as involved as you want, to be advisor, director, whatever role feels right. This is your vision as much as mine." Emma had studied the plans carefully, her expression thoughtful. "It needs to be accessible. Not just for the horses, but for people like me who use wheelchairs." "Absolutely. I've already spoken with accessibility consultants. Every aspect of the facility will be designed with that in mind." Emma had looked up at her father, surprise and tentative hope in her eyes. "You're serious about this?" "About all of it. I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Richard had assured her. "Chance showed me what true loyalty means. What love means. I lost sight of that somewhere along the way, but I'm finding my way back. If you'll help me." 3 months later, the Sullivan Mountain property had undergone a remarkable transformation. The main house remained, though Richard rarely used it now, preferring the renovated guest cabin where he could be closer to the developing rehabilitation center. The stables had been expanded and modernized, with specialized equipment for treating injured and traumatized horses. Martin, now recovered enough to walk with assistance of a cane, had returned to the property in a new role, consultant for the rehabilitation center. His decades of experience with horses proving invaluable to the professional staff Richard had hired. Most importantly, the facility had been designed with Emma at its heart. Every doorway, pathway, and workspace was wheelchair accessible. Specialized equipment allowed her to work directly with the horses despite her mobility limitations. Richard had hired the best equine therapists in the country to train both Emma and the staff in cutting-edge techniques for rehabilitating traumatized and injured horses. On the day of the center's unofficial opening, a small, private ceremony before it would begin accepting horses from across the region, Emma and Richard stood together in the main paddock, watching as Chance trotted proudly around the perimeter, fully recovered from his ordeal. "He looks happy," Richard observed, genuinely moved by the horse's transformation. "Like he knows this place is partly because of him." "I think he does know," Emma replied, looking up at her father with a smile that reached her eyes, something that had been increasingly common in recent weeks. "Chance has always been special that way." Richard nodded, his gaze moving from the horse to his daughter. The past months had changed her too. There was a confidence in her posture, a light in her eyes that had been dimmed after the accident, but now burned brightly again. She had found her purpose in this place, working with the horses that had always understood her best. "Emma," he said quietly, "I want you to know something. This center, everything we're building here, it's not just about making amends or easing my guilt. It's about finally seeing what was always most important. You, your happiness, your future." Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, Dad. And I'm starting to believe it's real this time." The forgiveness implicit in her words and touch sent a wave of emotion through Richard that he didn't try to suppress. This new version of himself, more vulnerable, more authentic, still felt unfamiliar at times, but increasingly, it felt right. "Have you thought about my suggestion?" Emma asked after a moment. "About expanding the program to include therapeutic riding for kids with disabilities?" Richard smiled. His daughter's vision for the center had quickly grown beyond horse rehabilitation to include programs for humans who might benefit from equine therapy, particularly children with conditions similar to her own. "I've already contacted several specialists," he confirmed. "If you're ready to take that on, we can start developing the program immediately." Emma's face lit up with excitement. "Really? That's incredible. There are so many kids who could benefit, Dad. Kids who feel isolated and different, like I did after the accident. Horses like Chance could help them find their confidence again, just like he did for me." Richard felt his heart swell with pride and love for the remarkable young woman his daughter had become, not because of him, but often despite him. Then we'll make it happen. As they continued discussing their plans, Chance approached the fence where they stood, reaching his muzzle over to nuzzle Emma's hair affectionately. She laughed, stroking his velvety nose with obvious adoration. "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, "there's something I've been wondering about. How did Chance find Martin that night? And how did he know to go to the evacuation center with your message? Even the rescuers said it was almost impossible to navigate in those conditions." Emma smiled mysteriously. "Some things don't need scientific explanations, Dad. Sometimes, love is enough to guide you home." Richard considered this, watching as his daughter communicated with the horse in that special, wordless language they shared. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps there were forces at work in the world that couldn't be measured or quantified, like the bond between a girl and her horse, or the capacity for a broken relationship to heal with time and genuine effort. "I'm still learning that," he admitted. "But I'm getting there." 6 months after the blizzard that had changed everything, the Sullivan Equine Rehabilitation Center officially opened to the public. What had begun as one man's attempt at redemption had grown into something truly extraordinary, a place of healing for animals and humans alike. The local media covered the opening extensively, fascinated by the story of the wealthy businessman who had transformed his mountain retreat into a non-profit sanctuary after a near-tragic experience. Richard, once obsessed with controlling his public image, allowed the coverage with minimal intervention, understanding that their story might inspire others. The true highlight of the opening day, however, was the inaugural session of the Chance program, Emma's initiative for children with mobility impairments. Watching from the observation area as his daughter guided a nervous 8-year-old girl through her first interaction with a gentle therapy horse, Richard felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in decades. Martin stepped up beside him, his cane thumping softly on the wooden floor. "Quite something, isn't it?" the older man remarked, nodding toward Emma. "She's amazing," Richard agreed. "I missed so much Martin. So many years, I could have been watching her become this person." "But you're here now," Martin pointed out. "That's what matters in the end." Richard nodded, accepting both the truth and the implicit forgiveness in the caretaker's words. Their relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship over the months of shared purpose and gradual healing. Across the grass paddock, Chance stood at attention, seemingly observing the therapy session with intelligent interest. Though he was no longer an active therapy horse himself, Emma had decided he deserved a special status. After his heroic efforts, he remained an important tapper, presence at the center, often seeming to sense which humans or horses needed his particular brand of compassion on any given day. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the children had gone home with stories of their magical day with Cal, the horses, Richard found Emma sitting alone on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, indicating the space beside her wheelchair. "Please," she replied, her smile warm and genuine. Richard sat down on the porch swing, content to share the peaceful moment with his daughter. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer fraught with resentment and unspoken grievances. They had learned to talk to each other again, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered over years of neglect, and culminating in that terrible night during the September blizzard. "I heard from the board today," Richard said eventually. "The quarterly results are in." Emma glanced at him, curious but not concerned. "And Sullivan Industries is thriving under the new arrangement. Carlisle's team has implemented some significant changes, most of them for the better." Richard shook his head, bemused. "The irony is, if I had gone to that meeting, I would have fought those changes with everything I had. I would have seen them as a threat to my control, not as opportunities for growth." "And now?" Emma asked. "Now I understand there are many ways to build a legacy. Sullivan Industries was just one chapter." He looked directly at his daughter, his expression sincere. "What we're creating here together, this is the work that will truly matter in the end." Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you, Dad, for what that's worth." "It's worth everything," Richard replied softly. As the sun sank below the mountain ridge, casting long shadows across the property, A familiar whinny drew their attention. Chance had approached the cabin and now stood near the porch steps, his intelligent gaze fixed on father and daughter. "He checks on you every evening," Richard observed. "Has since we moved back to the property." Emma nodded. "I know. It's like he wants to make sure I'm not alone." She wheeled closer to the steps, extending her hand to the horse. "I never will be again, thanks to you, boy." Chance nickered softly, pressing his muzzle against her palm in a gesture of pure affection. Then, surprisingly, he turned his attention to Richard, approaching him with deliberate steps. Richard remained still, uncertain of the horse's intention, though Chance had gradually accepted his presence over the months. The animal had maintained a certain reserve around him, as if still judging whether Richard's transformation was genuine. Now, Chance stretched his neck forward, his breath warm against Richard's face, as intelligent brown eyes studied him intently. After a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the horse gently pressed his forehead against Richard's chest, a gesture of acceptance, and, perhaps, forgiveness. Richard raised a trembling hand to stroke the horse's neck, emotion tightening his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, "for sating them both. For giving me another chance I didn't deserve." Chance snorted softly, as if to say the debt had been acknowledged and accepted. Then he turned, trotting back toward the paddock where he would spend the night under the stars, secure in the knowledge that his human family was whole once more. Emma watched him go, her expression peaceful. "You know what I think?" she said, turning to her father. "I think sometimes people get exactly the miracle they need, even if it comes in an unexpected form." Richard nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. His miracle had come in the form of a blizzard that stripped away his pretenses, a daughter whose capacity for forgiveness humbled him daily, and a horse whose courage and loyalty had shown him the path back to his humanity. "The miracle I needed," he agreed softly, "and the second chance I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve." As darkness fell completely over the mountain, father and daughter remained on the porch, their relationship forever changed by the storm that had nearly destroyed them and the horse that had never given up. In the paddock below, Chance stood watch, his loyalty unwavering, his heart boundless, his spirit a testament to the extraordinary power of love to guide lost souls home. 1 year to the day after the blizzard, the Sullivan Equine Rehabilitation Center held a special celebration. What had begun as a small operation had blossomed into a nationally recognized facility, with horses and clients coming from across the country to benefit from their innovative programs. The Chance program had been particularly successful, with dozens of children with mobility impairments finding new confidence and joy through their interactions with the gentle therapy horses. Emma had emerged as a gifted instructor, her personal experience giving her unique insight into the challenges her young students faced. For the anniversary celebration, Richard had commissioned a special bronze statue to stand at the center's entrance, a life-sized representation of Chance, head held high, mane flowing as if caught in a winter wind. The plaque at the base read simply, "For the horse who never gave up, and taught us to do the same." As Emma cut the ribbon to officially unveil the statue, surrounded by staff, clients, and supporters, she caught her father's eye across the crowd. The pride and love in his gaze brought a warm flush to her cheeks. They had come so far in a year's time from broken and distant to a team working together toward a shared vision. Later, as guests mingled and celebrated the center's success, Richard found himself standing beside the paddock where Chance now grazed peacefully. The horse had aged a bit in the years since his heroic journey, with touches of gray appearing around his muzzle, but his eyes remained as bright and intelligent as ever. "You changed everything," Richard said quietly to the horse. "My relationship with Emma, my priorities, my understanding of what matters in this life." Chance lifted his head, regarding Richard with what almost seemed like understanding before returning to his grazing. Richard smiled, no longer surprised by the horse's apparent comprehension. He had learned to accept that some connections transcended ordinary explanation. Martin joined him at the fence, moving more comfortably with his cane now. "Quite a transformation, isn't it?" the older man remarked, gesturing toward the bustling rehabilitation center. "Hard to believe, it's only been a year." Richard nodded. Sometimes I still wake up thinking it was all a dream. The storm, the rescue, everything that followed. Then I remember it was all too real. The best changes often come from our darkest moments, Martin observed. If you hadn't left them that night, please don't try to make what I did sound noble, Richard interrupted. It was the worst mistake of my life. Martin considered this, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. But the aftermath, what you've built here with Emma, what you've become, that's something to be proud of. Before Richard could respond, Emma wheeled up to join them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Dad! Martin! You won't believe it. We just got approval for the expansion. We can break ground on the new therapy center next month. The expansion had been Emma's dream, a purpose-built facility, specifically designed for human equine therapy programs, with features to accommodate clients with various disabilities. Richard had supported the vision wholeheartedly, working alongside Emma to secure the necessary funding and approvals. That's wonderful news, Richard said warmly, genuinely delighted by his daughter's excitement. You've worked so hard for this, Emma. It's well-deserved. We've all worked for it, she corrected him. This is our achievement, together. The simple inclusion hour meant more to Richard than Emma could possibly know. After years of isolation in his corporate tower, the shared purpose he had found with his daughter and their growing team filled a void he hadn't realized existed within him. As the celebration continued around them, Richard reflected on the journey of the past year. He had lost control of his company, but gained something far more valuable, a relationship with his daughter, based on mutual respect and shared values. He had exchanged power for purpose, and in doing so, found a contentment that had eluded him for decades. And it had all begun with a horse who refused to abandon those he loved, even in the face of impossible odds. A horse who had shown more courage, more loyalty, more heart than Richard had believed possible, and in doing so, had taught a cold-hearted father the meaning of true love. As twilight descended on the mountain, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and indigo, Emma, Richard, and Martin stood together at the paddock fence, watching as Chance and the other horses settled in for the night. No words were needed between them. They had become a family forged through crisis and redeemed through genuine change. In the growing darkness, Chance approached the fence one last time, pressing his muzzle gently against Emma's outstretched hand. She smiled, stroking his velvety nose with obvious affection. "Good boy," she whispered. "The very best boy." The horse nickered softly in response, then turned his intelligent gaze to Richard, who nodded in silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between them. They had both learned what it meant to truly love Emma, not as a possession or an obligation, but as a person worthy of devotion and sacrifice. As Chance trotted away to join his equine companions, Richard placed his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder, feeling a profound gratitude for this second chance he'd been given. The bitter cold man who had abandoned his daughter in a blizzard was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true wealth had nothing to do with corporate boardrooms or stock prices. True wealth, Richard had learned, was standing beside the people you love, under a star-filled sky, working together toward a shared purpose, grateful for each day and each opportunity to make a difference in the world. It was the knowledge that when the storms of life raged most fiercely, what mattered most was not power or control, but the courage to never give up on those who needed you. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Richard made a silent promise to Chance, to Emma, and to himself. He would never forget the lessons of that terrible night, nor the extraordinary grace that had allowed him to find his way home. The horse had shown him the way, and now it was his responsibility to walk the path with unwavering commitment for all the days to come. In the quiet of the mountain evening, surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses settling for the night, Richard Sullivan finally understood what true success looked like. It wasn't measured in dollars or corporate acquisitions, but in restored relationships, healed hearts, and the knowledge that when it mattered most, you had chosen love over fear, connection over isolation, redemption over pride. It was the most valuable lesson he had ever learned, taught not in prestigious business schools or corporate boardrooms, but by a chestnut horse with a white blaze, who, on the darkest night of winter, had never given up.